All right, hey, good morning. Happy Mother's Day to you all. One day, people are going to gather in a room like this to mourn your death and to celebrate your life. And on that day, words will be spoken about you. And in this series, over the next 2 months, we're hoping that you will honestly try to answer two questions. And the first question is this: if today were your last, what words would best describe your life? And the second question is, what words do you want to describe your life? We're looking at the story of a remarkable man named David. And David's life ebbed and flowed with headline-making triumphs and tabloid-like tragedies. But we're taking 8 events from his life that poignantly tell his story and show us what he was about. And out of those stories, we're compiling a list of 8 words that most described his life, that best describe David. Now, we're not doing this to eulogize David so much as we are to inspire you, that you would choose your 8 words well. Now, the first word last week that Matt told you that described David is the word trust. He was a man at the core of his being. He trusted God, and because of that, he was able to act in ways that demonstrated God's power. Now, nowhere is that seen more clearly than in the famous story of David and Goliath. Goliath is this monster of a man who was a killing specialist. He was a warrior giant who was so fierce and intimidating that he was able to paralyze the entire Israelite army in fear. And he is defeated by an adolescent with a strap of leather and a few smooth stones and a faith that defined his life. Now that story has all the elements that we love in a good story, especially us guys. Right? It's the ultimate underdog story. It's got weapons and trash talking and violence and bravery. It has David walking out from behind the protective lines of shields and spears, walking out into the open where he is all alone, where there's nowhere to hide, there's no one to turn to, just him and this hulking killing machine, Goliath. We like that story because it appeals to our rugged individualism. We like that story because it gives us the idea that we can face down any obstacle or any challenge that we have alone. That if I just have enough trust, enough guts, I can stare down the giants in my life. We like that story because it makes us think that all we need is courage and grit, and we love that idea. But here's the deal: it's not true. It's not true. Very rarely will you be called to stand on your own and do what faith requires. Those are so rare. They'll be rare in your life. They were rare in David's life. David's story is going to take a turn, and he's going to go from the highest of highs to the soul-crushing depths of despair. And we're going to see that when that happens, David isn't going to get by with just a little bit more trust. His rugged individualism isn't going to see him through. He is going to need something else. Something that he desperately needs is the same thing that you desperately need. The thing that if you have it, it will make your life, and if you don't, it will break your life. Now, before I get to what that thing is, let's pick up on David's story. So Goliath is dead. The Philistine army is routed, and David finds himself an overnight celebrity. Right? Men admire him, women love him, little boys are pretending to be him when they're playing. Little girls have got his poster up on their bedroom wall. Like, everybody loves David. He is trending upward, right? He is the man in Israel. Now, Saul, the king, of course, is pretty impressed with David, and he brings David into his inner court, into the palace, and he wants David close by. And overnight, David goes from sleeping with sheep to sleeping in the palace. And while he's in the palace, he's going to prove that he's no one-hit wonder. That Goliath wasn't a fluke. In fact, we read these words in Samuel. whatever Saul sent David to do, David did so successfully that Saul gave him a high rank in the army. This pleased all the people and Saul's officers as well. This shepherd boy is so high achieving that whatever he does it so well that Saul says this is a no-brainer, and he just fast-tracks him up to leadership in the army. And the crazy thing is, all those people who David bypassed and took their position, they're pleased with it. They're like, that was a good choice. Everybody loves David. Things are going great for him. Until Saul is out and about, and Saul is out with his entourage, and they're walking down the street, and the people crowd the street because they want to see the king. And Saul hears them singing. He's like, what are they singing? And he hears them singing this: Saul has slayed his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. Let me translate that for you. Saul is great. David is greater. We love Saul. We love David even more. Now, if you remember 2 weeks ago, I shared with you that Saul had some serious character defects. He had some serious flaws in his character. And those character flaws are going to come up to the surface now. And Saul starts to seethe with anger and jealousy. And he's like, what do you mean they love David more than me? And Saul begins to slowly stew in his loathing for David. In fact, but David just keeps succeeding, and everything that Saul gives him to do, he just keeps hitting it out of the park. And so he becomes more and more popular, and people praise David more and more. And at this, Saul becomes utterly mentally unhinged. And we read that he was in a room with David, and he grabs a spear, and he goes and he tries to stick David to the wall with the spear. He tries to kill him. Twice he throws a spear at him. David ninjas his way out of the way, and Saul freaks out at this. And it said that fear overcame Saul, because he realized there was something about David, that God was with David. And you can read between the lines that conversation that Saul had with Samuel, saying, God is going to take the anointing off you, Saul, and he's going to give it to another man who will be king, a man after my own heart, a man who I will be with. And you realize that Saul is starting to put it together that this guy is probably the one who's going to replace him, who's going to do what he can't do. And so Saul has fear against him, but he's also threatened. His ego is challenged. His leadership is threatened. And so he comes up with this more sinister plan to get rid of David. And it goes like this: David, do you want to marry my daughter? That was his plan. No, there's more to the plan. He said, you can marry my daughter who loves you, but here's the cost. If you want to marry my daughter, it's going to cost you 100 Philistine foreskins. Right, I'm not making this up. That was the cost. 100 Philistine foreskins. Now, Saul is thinking that surely one of those 100 guys is going to be so, partial to his foreskin that he is going to kill David. He's like, you ain't taking my foreskin. Like, what are you talking about, right? And so that is Saul's plan, that the Philistines will do his dirty work. Interesting fact: 100 Philistine foreskin is also the price to date one of my daughters. So if you got kids out there, you might want to start saving up, because that's the price. David, that's the last time I'll say that. No, maybe I'll say it one more time. David is so successful at Philistine foreskin shucking, I'm having fun with this, that he comes back with not 100 but 200. And what does this do? The whole plan backfires on Saul, because now David's going to be his son-in-law, part of the family. And not only that, David's fame is just growing. Everybody loves David even more, except for Saul and 200 Philistines. Right? Okay, I should get back to my notes here. And the more that David succeeds and thrives, the more that Saul begins to boil with hatred, until he finally loses it. And he sets out a plan, and he commands his men to go hunt down David and kill him. And David goes from national hero to public enemy number one. And David is on the run. And he's desperate, and he's afraid, and he himself is coming unhinged. And you're going to see that David, the guy who could have enough trust and faith to stare down Goliath, isn't going to get through with just more rugged individualism. Another dose of trust isn't going to get him through. He needs something else, the same thing that you and I need. And you know what he needed? Friendship. Friendship. Because a life of significance will have significant friends. A life of significance will have significant friends. And you're thinking, friendship? You were waiting for me to say something a little bit more dazzling, something a little bit more gripping than friendship. But hear me out. You're thinking that way because friendship has become so underappreciated, undervalued in our culture that the type of friendship that I'm talking about risks becoming an endangered species. Friendship today, that fundamental human relationship, is undergoing so much unfortunate, reimagining and rebranding and re-engineering that it is deflating down from one of the most important, complex dynamics of human relationships. It's deflating down to this list of digital profiles where we can scan carefully curated images and occasionally click an icon of approval. That's what friendship is becoming. But listen, a busy Facebook feed does not mean you have got vibrant friendships. Those are utterly different things. And so I want to talk to you about friendship because troubles and hardships and strife will visit your life. Storms will blow into your world, and you will sink without friends. So we read that David is called to Saul, and David gives an account of what happens with Goliath. And while he's talking, he's given this account with Goliath while he's holding on to Goliath's severed head, which is just awesome. It's like Hamlet. He's like telling the story. He's got Goliath's head right there. And we read these words, that as he's given an account, Jonathan, who is Saul's oldest son, we read these words, Jonathan became one in spirit with David, and he loved David as himself. Now your translation might say, Saul and Jonathan, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David. And what the writer is trying to get at, he's trying to say, and he will repeatedly stress this over the next 5 chapters of Samuel, that there was such a deep abiding connection between Jonathan and between David. It was like a brotherly love that was so deep. And I want to look at Jonathan and the way that he is a friend to David, and I want to pull 4 things, 4 aspects of friendship that I want to try to rebrand your own friendship and how you view yourself as a friend and the things that you might prioritize in your close relationships. 4 things. The first thing that makes a great friend is that a great friendship needs a commitment level that will sacrifice for the relationship. A great friendship needs a commitment level that you'll sacrifice for the relationship. And let me just state the obvious. That we are creatures of comfort and ease. And we do not like relationships that demand much of us. We're not used to building relationships on a foundation of sacrifice. Today, the face-to-face relationships we have, we build them on this kind of transactional friendship, where it's give and take. I'll give to you, you reciprocate back to me. I'll call you, but next time you better call me. No, we can't have them over for a barbecue. We had them over last time. It's their turn. Right? It's like, it's this type of transactional relationship where no one person is ever indebted. The ledger always has to come out to zero. And if that is your foundational, there is no room for sacrifice, for prolonged sacrifice for another. In that type of mentality, if we think of people as give and take. Listen, great friendships, though they are never one-sided, are also never transactional. Great friendships are utterly selfless. We don't go into a relationship because of what they can add, the value that they add to our life. A true friendship doesn't seek or expect its own good. It doesn't love for what it will receive. It loves for what it can give. And this is Jonathan. In fact, we read these words, that Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. He's making this choice. He's making this commitment to David. Now, the language of covenant is a bit strange to us. But what this is a heart pledge that Jonathan is giving David, saying, David, no matter what happens, I'm with you. I'm for you. I'm for your good. I will work for your good. That's what he's pledging himself to. Now, in that day, when you made a covenant, there was also often a symbolic act that went along that kind of defined the covenant. It showed the boundaries of what the covenant is. And here Jonathan does something so remarkable. We read these words. Jonathan took off his robe. This is his royal robe that he was wearing. And he gave it to David, along with his tunic and even his sword, his bow, and his belt. Jonathan takes off his royal robe. Now remember, Jonathan is Saul's oldest son, which means that he is the king in waiting. The people said, give us a king like the other nations. And this is how monarchies work. The eldest son becomes the next king. And Jonathan, in taking off his robe and putting it on David, says, I'm not going to be king. You're going to be king. You're going to be my king. I put myself under you. And he takes off every symbol of his power, his sword and his bow, and he gives it to him. And he says, I put my power, everything that I have, all of my influence, all of my gifts, I put it at your disposal for your good. David, you will increase and I will decrease to make you king. This is remarkable. Because this covenant cost Jonathan everything. Friendships thrive when there's a commitment level that's willing to sacrifice for the other's good. When I think of sacrificial friendships, of course, the best illustration that always comes to my mind is from Lord of the Rings. Right? Every good sermon illustration can be found actually in Lord of the Rings, but this one especially. Because if you know the story and you've read the books or you've watched the movie, you know that the hero of the story isn't Frodo. The hero of the story isn't Aragorn. The hero of the story isn't Gandalf. Do you know who the true hero of the story is? Who's the hero of the story? Samwise Gamgee. Frodo comes and is given this burden that could very well take his life, that will undo everything that he knows. And Sam says, why am I getting emotional at Sam? Sam says, right, the orcs come and I'm crying. It's like they're slaying and I'm like, Sam. No, Sam comes and says, Mr. Frodo, you are not going to carry this alone. I'm going with you. Even if it means I leave the Shire and I leave everything I know and all the safety and security, I'm with you. And as the story gets more and more dark and they get further from home and danger becomes more prevalent and looks like they might not survive, Sam says these words. He says, I made a promise, Mr. Frodo. I said, don't you leave him, Samwise Gamgee, and I plan to keep it. And he did. And of course, you know the story. They get into Mordor, and they start climbing Mount Doom, and the weight of the burden is too great for Frodo, and he is just done, and he collapses, and he can't go on. And what does Sam do? Sam says, I can't carry the ring, Mr. Frodo, but I can carry you. And he picks him up, and he carries him. And the ring is destroyed, and the world is saved, all because of loyal Sam, who had nothing to offer but his loyalty and friendship. Friendships cost us. They require sacrifice. And while different relationships will have unique sacrifices, the one thing that they all need is the one thing that we are so loath to give up, and it's time. Time is that finite commodity that is our most valuable possession we have. And all of us feel like we don't have enough of it. And all of us feel like we guard it. And when we do have a little bit, we feel like we need to spend it on us, to increase value to us and to help us feel better. And we would spend it this way. And deep friendships will always be in conflict with this need for ease and self. I read a 2016 study in the Financial Post that said the average North American spends 5 hours a week on Facebook. That's the average. 5 hours scrolling through news feeds of selfies and cat videos and rants against Donald Trump. Right? 5 hours a week to that. If you're feeling like, oh man, I'm so taxed and I wish I had more time for my friends and I don't have a friend where they're sacrificing my way or I'm sacrificing your way, might I suggest that you take your Facebook 5 hours a week and you cut that in half. And for every minute that you give the digital counterfeit, you'll give your friend face to face. And I promise you that in 2.5 hours a week, your friendships will grow and thrive. But here's the deal. Rather than sacrifice for friendships, we will sacrifice them at the digital altar. It's because we don't think we just don't think they're that important. So how are we doing for time? What if I should tell a story? It's not in my sermon, but it's a story about me and Matt. You okay if I add 5 minutes to the sermon to tell you a good story?
Yes.
So Matt's one of my best friends, and I have a depth of friendship with him that is fairly rare in my life. And I just like to say he's Sam to me Frodo, right? He's a little bit overweight, and I'm small, and he's hairy like Sam is, and he carries me often when I need it. And I wanted to do this bike race, a 7-day bike race, and it was going to be one of those epic things that was kind of a once-in-a-lifetime deal, and I wanted to share it with somebody, and I wanted to share it with Matt, and so I talked Matt into doing this race, and so we trained for this race, and it's 7 days, and it's grueling, and we came to this agreement that we were going to ride hard, but ride reasonable, because we wanted to enjoy it. And so Matt was multiple times. We had we're going to ride at 75%. We know our heart rate level, and we're going to ride at underneath our 75% rate. Right. I'm like, yep, we're going to do that. And so we go and we ride day one, and I get a flat tire, and we lose 10 minutes changing the tire, and we come on in, and we were thinking we're not going to go kill ourselves because what's the point of riding at 100% and we finish 24th, or riding at 75% and we finish 27th? Like, what's the big difference? So let's just go and enjoy it. So we come in day one, and we find out we're 4th. And I was like, forget all that stuff. I was like, we can get on the podium. And so Matt's like, no, this is not what we agreed upon. I said, screw what we agreed upon. I'm going for glory. So the next day, it's 50K, and I get on my bike, and I hammer as hard as I can for 50 straight kilometers. And within 800 meters of the finish line, we pass the first place team, and we come first. And we post these pictures on Facebook, and you guys are sending encouraging comments, and you're writing stuff like, Matt has slayed his thousands, and Sean his tens of thousands. Right? You see what I just did there? That's biblical trash talking right there. And so I'm just like, I've just hooked the bug. It's like, I want the glory. I want to be on there. And Matt's like, no way, man, we can't do this. And so this friction is starting to build. And I'm trying to push us, and Matt's trying to slow us down. And you'd see it, they'd have these food stations. And they were twice in a race where you can kind of get, calories in. I'm going to hurry up this story because I still got a whole sermon to do. We go to these food stations, and 5 kilometers out, I would strategize exactly what I was going to do. I'd hop off my bike, I'd grab 2 bananas and a granola bar, and I fill up my water bottle, and I'm ready to go. And Matt comes in, and he gets off his bike, and he's like, it's like it's at a buffet, and he wanders up and down, and he looks at the stuff, and meanwhile, riders are going. I'm like, come on. And he's doing it just to bug me, I know it. And he's slowly sampling stuff, and he's talking to the people, and I'm just like freaking out. And so I'm getting angry, he's getting angry, and they're starting to get this anger between us. Because more important than the covenant I made with Matt is this glory that I want for winning this race. And Matt was right, we couldn't sustain this pace. And on day 5, my knees are swollen up, and my Achilles heels are so tight I could barely walk, and I could barely finish day 6 and day 5, and then day 6, Matt just crashes because we went too hard, and we kind of dribble our way in. But we're going into day 7, and we're sitting 2nd overall, and we're 14 minutes behind the first place team, and we're 38 minutes up on the 3rd place team. We got a good cushion, and my family is going to be at the finish line. And I was like, come on, Matt, we can just dig deep. For 38 more kilometers, we can dig deep. And so we get off and we start riding. And 5 kilometers in, I look and Matt's nowhere around. And so I'm like, what the heck? So I pull over and I wait, and riders are going by, and I'm like, what the heck? I'm like, and more riders are going by, and I'm like, come on, Matt. And then the third, the team that's chasing us, they pass us, and I'm freaking out, and I'm thinking, well, Matt must have had a flat, so he's probably fixing it. And then I'm checking and 10 minutes go by, and I'm like, okay, it can't be a flat. And I'm like, what could it be? And I'm like, I know it. A Mexican taco truck pulled up, and they're giving free samples, and he's eating tacos. I'm sure that's what's going on. And riders keep passing by, and we got passed by 500 riders. And I'm like, but as I'm wondering what's going on, I start like, this isn't normal, and 10 minutes goes into 20 minutes, which goes into 30 minutes, and now I'm starting to get concerned because we had passed a guy who was one of our guys we were racing against who crashed, broken ankle, hit his head, had a brain bleed in his head, had to be airlifted to the hospital. We passed a guy on a spine board. We passed another person who got helicoptered out with a broken neck. And I start thinking, oh man, maybe Matt's hurt. And suddenly this race just seems so stupid. Right? This friendship is so much more important. But I was willing to sacrifice our enjoyment together for this awesome trophy that's in my office. Woo! Right? But I was willing to do that. And I'm just saying, the point of the story is this, is that when we look back at the end of our lives, you're going to see how critical your relationships were, and the ones that you sacrificed for and invested in, you are never going to regret, but there are 1,000 things that will pull you away from them. All right, great relationships need sacrifice. I'm going to burn through the last 3. When you have a person who's willing to sacrifice and they express that type of love, it opens you up to the second thing that you need in a great relationship, and that is vulnerability. It's the willingness to be real with one another. We read these words. David got up from the south side of the stone and bowed down before Jonathan 3 times with his face to the ground. When they kissed each other, then they kissed each other and wept together, but David wept the most. And let me just say one thing. I just got to pause in the sermon and say one thing, because in our hyper-sexualized culture, this passage has been used by some to suggest that David and Jonathan weren't just friends, they were lovers. But it wasn't just bromance, it was romance going on between them. Here's the deal. If you read that, there is not a hint to suggest that in anywhere in Scripture. In fact, we are reading this act through our cultural expression, but in ancient Near East, this idea of greeting each other with a kiss was common. It wasn't seen as sexual, it was just part of what you did. How did Judas greet Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane? With a kiss. What does Paul say to the church, I think in Corinth? Greet one another with a holy kiss. It was a culturally accepted thing. It wasn't seen as sexual at all. But what I want you to see here is how vulnerable these 2 men are with each other. David doesn't hold anything back. He doesn't hold back his affection. He doesn't hold back his anxiety. He shares the full scope of what he is going through. And in his weeping, it's because he is overwhelmed by what is happening in Saul's attempt to try to kill him. Listen, when we are real and open with another person, it allows us to not only bear their burdens, but have them bear ours. It allows us to apply our friendship to the place of greatest need. Listen, the burden that is unknown cannot be borne. The friendship which God gifts to bring healing and strengthening to you that balm cannot be applied if you hide the wound all the time. Vulnerability isn't you sharing the 80 or 90% that you're comfortable with. And listen, it's sharing the last 10%. And this is hard for us. This is hard for me. I've grown up where I keep my cards pretty close to my chest on that last 10%. There's not a lot of people I share it with. And if you've been hurt at all in relationships, or you felt the sting of slander against you, we're even more tempted to build up bigger walls, to keep more and more of ourselves on this side of the wall. But listen, that will result in shallow, superficial friendships, and the power of friendship will go to neutral, and it will never be applied in your life. It's only when we're vulnerable can the power of friendship be brought to that place of our greatest need. Now, let me ask you, is there anybody in your life who you share the last 10% with? Is there anybody in your life who really knows you? And I don't mean your spouse, because I hope your spouse does, but listen, you cannot expect your spouse to carry all the relational weight that you need. They were never designed to. If you put that all on them, you will slowly crush them. You need to be open with somebody else. And do you have that person? Because when we are open, when we are vulnerable with another person, C.S. Lewis says it opens us up to the most powerful 2 words in friendship. And those 2 words are, me too. When you're willing to be vulnerable, you're inviting somebody else into your humanity. There's now a shared humanity. There's a commonness. Not only that, there's a commonness for our need and our brokenness and our hurts. I talked to a good friend this week who said that he was pulled out of the pit, the suicidal pit, by the love of a good friend. And that never would have happened if he hadn't have been vulnerable. And listen, I have been to too many funerals. And I've done too many funerals of people who have done just super dramatic things to end their pain because they feel like they can't bear it anymore and they've got nobody to bear it with them. And it's because we hide that 10%, and that 10% is the place where we share it, that the power of friendship is released. It was for David, it is for you. It's hard to be real and vulnerable with another person. But friends are God's gift to us to help us become who we're meant to be. And vulnerability is the key that opens up that gift. Because when we're vulnerable, then we can apply the third aspect of friendship. And it's this: true friendships strengthen us in God. Look at 1 Samuel 23. And Saul's son Jonathan went to David at Horesh and helped him find strength in God. David is at his almost lowest point. And Jonathan goes to him, and he doesn't just encourage him in himself. He doesn't give him a pep talk and say, man, you're the one who defeated Goliath. It'll get better. No, what does he do? He doesn't strengthen David in David. He strengthens David in God. Because here's the deal. We need friendship. I need friendship. You need friendship. David needed friendship. But even more than David needed Jonathan, you know what David needed? David needed God. And Jonathan was the means by which David got more of God. True friends strengthen us in God at our place of vulnerability. I'm going to skip a whole bunch of stuff and fast track on to point 4. And how do they do that? Well, they do that because we sacrifice time to be with them. They do that because we're willing to be vulnerable. They strengthen us in God because the truth is nobody is meant to carry burdens solo, and nobody defeats sin as a soldier, but as an army. That's how everything is engineered for us, is together. And so how do you strengthen somebody in God? This is the fourth point of friendship. It's the last mark of biblical friendship. We strengthen people in God by reminding each other of the promises of God. Look what Jonathan does. Jonathan says this: "Fear not, for the hand of Saul my father shall not find you. You shall be king over Israel, and I will be next to you." Saul my father knows this. What is he doing? He's saying, I don't care how things look, David. This is what God promised you. This is the truth of who He is. This is the truth of what He said. This is the truth of what He has declared about you. You will be king. And that's where the real strength of friendship is. To help us persevere, to help us forgive, to help us find power to change and defeat sin and overcome, is by reminding each other the promises of God. That's the gospel. And that's the gospel because every promise of God are yes and amen in Jesus. And so real friends speak Jesus into our area of hurt and vulnerability. I remember sharing with one of my friends in this church about this kind of irrational fear I had about losing one of my daughters, my middle daughter. I had just I'd have these dreams about it, and I had this anxiety, and I realized that in this fear I had a whole bunch of stuff going on, but the truth is I doubted God's plan, and I doubted His goodness, and I felt like I couldn't control what might happen in her life. And rather than my friend saying, you know what, your daughter's going to be fine, right? She's healthy, living great, the stats are this, she's going to, right? He didn't do any of that. He reminded me of the promises of God, the character of God. That God says that there isn't a single thing in the entire universe that could separate you from Him or my daughter from Him. There isn't a single thing that happens that isn't under His gaze, that He is not in control, that He does not promise He will work for good. He reminded me of the character and promises of God, and that is what closed that wound. That's what a good friend does. They strengthen us in God by reminding us of the gospel. True friends will sacrifice for a friendship. When you do that, it demonstrates trust, and that helps us become vulnerable. And vulnerability is the key to unlocking the power of friendship, because it helps us to apply the balm of friendship at our place of greatest need. And we do that by strengthening each other in God. And we strengthen each other in God by reminding each other of the promises of God. And so let me leave you with one staggering promise of God that you might hear afresh today. That Jesus is this: I don't call you servants, but friends. I call you friends. Which means, of course, that Jesus has sacrificed for us. That Jesus has taken off the royal robe of His sonship and He has put it on your shoulders. That He unbuckled the belt of all of His power and He became weak so that you could be strengthened eternally in God. That Jesus was the one who was utterly vulnerable. That He nailed His arms open wide and He hung naked on the cross, not just for 90% of your stuff, but for the other 10% too, so that you can be completely vulnerable, because He knows it all and He's paid for it all. Jesus is the one who promises you, I will strengthen you forever in God. I will be your BFFE, your best friend for eternity. I will forever remind you and proclaim to you and show you the promises of God are true in me. And that's amazing. But even just as amazing is to flip that around and say Jesus isn't just saying, I'm your friend. He says, I want you to be mine. I want you to be mine. There is something in you that brings such joy and fullness to the Godhead that Jesus says, I will sacrifice and be vulnerable, and I will give it all to have him or her as my friend. And listen, part of what Jesus is saying, he wants you to grow in your friendship. He wants you to sacrifice more for Jesus. You know how we do that? We start sacrificing more for each other. Jesus wants you to be more vulnerable and real with him. You know how we do that? We start being more vulnerable and real with each other. Jesus wants you to be strengthened in God. You know how we do that? We strengthen each other in God. Jesus wants you to live on the promises of God. You know how we do that? We remind each other of the promises of God. It comes back to us being friends helps Jesus be our friend. Are you tracking with me? At the end of your life, they're going to say a bunch of words about you. I hope one of them is, he, she was a great, great friend. Let's pray. Lord, I thank you first off that you have done everything needed to not only come close and be our friend, but to call us yours. And God, it's hard for us to fathom that there would be such joy in having a relationship with us that you would endure the cross, but you tell us that's exactly what drove you. God, I thank you for the people who have been great friends to us, who have given time and have said those precious words, me too, have identified with us in that last 10% of our greatest aspirations or our hopes or our fears or our sin, and has come alongside us and has strengthened us through the promises and gospel of God. Thank you for those people, God. Thank you that there are I have numerous friends in this church who have done that to me. And I pray that you would help us desire to be that type of friend. Because God, I truly believe a life of significance will contain significant friendships. May friendships thrive at Mountainside for your glory and for our joy. Amen.